August 28, 1972. A scarlet plane climbs into the Staffordshire sky. At the controls, a prince. Handsome, brilliant, ninth in line to the British throne. 75 seconds later, he's dead. Prince William of Gloucester had everything. Cambridge education, royal blood, movie star looks. He spoke 5 languages, worked as a diplomat in Africa, and fell in love with a woman the palace would never accept. So he flew planes. Fast, reckless, like he was trying to outrun his own name. That afternoon, in front of thousands, his aircraft suddenly pitched, rolled, and slammed into the earth at devastating speed. The impact killed him instantly. He was 30 years old. Here's what makes this story truly devastating. You've probably never heard of him. 50 years later, Prince William of Gloucester has been erased from royal history, overshadowed by famous cousins, reduced to a footnote, forgotten by the institution he died trying to escape. This is the story of a prince who refused to just wave and smile, a man who fought for freedom and paid the ultimate price, a royal the palace would rather you never knew existed. To understand Prince William, you have to understand the peculiar position of the Gloucester family within the British royal hierarchy. They were royals, yes, but always secondary royals. The spare to the spare. The insurance policy nobody thought they'd ever need to claim. The Dukedom of Gloucester was created in 1928 for Prince Henry, the third son of King George V and Queen Mary. Henry was never expected to be important. His older brother Edward would be king. His second brother Albert, known as Bertie, was backup. Henry was just there. A tall, somewhat awkward young man with a stammer and a love of horses, assigned to military duties and provincial engagements that nobody else wanted. But being a minor royal came with certain advantages. Less scrutiny, more freedom, the ability to marry for something resembling love rather than pure dynastic calculation. In 1935, Henry married Lady Alice Montague Douglas Scott, daughter of the Duke of Buccleuch. She was beautiful, intelligent, and came from one of Scotland's grandest families. The wedding took place at Westminster Abbey, but it was a smaller, more subdued affair than a future king's marriage would have been. Alice's mother had died just weeks before, casting a shadow over the celebrations. They settled into a life of comfortable obscurity. Henry carried out royal duties dutifully, but without particular distinction. Alice became known for her elegance and her work with various charities. They had 2 sons, William, born in 1941, and Richard, born in 1944. The family lived at Barnwell Manor in Northamptonshire, a sprawling Jacobean house set on 2,500 acres of farmland. It wasn't a palace. There were no gilded ballrooms or armies of servants. It was a country estate, grand, certainly, but also practical, unpretentious, almost normal by royal standards. This was the world Prince William was born into. Not the gilded cage of Buckingham Palace, but something more ambiguous. Privileged, absolutely, but also peripheral, close enough to the throne to feel its weight, far enough away to occasionally forget it was there. The Gloucesters existed in a strange limbo. They attended state occasions and appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony for major celebrations, but they also lived lives that resembled those of the landed gentry more than working royals. They shot grouse, managed farms, sent their children to good schools, and largely stayed out of the newspapers. For William and Richard, this meant growing up with a foot in 2 worlds. They were princes. That was inescapable. But they were also just boys running around a country estate, climbing trees, learning to ride horses, attending local events where people knew them as the Gloucester boys, rather than Your Royal Highness. Their father, Prince Henry, struggled with the contradictions of his position. He had been raised for duty, trained to stand at attention and follow protocol. But he had also inherited his father George V's gruff temperament and his uncle David's, the future Edward VIII, restlessness. He drank too much. He could be distant, even cold, with his sons. The stammer that plagued him made public speaking torture, and he often appeared uncomfortable in formal settings. Alice compensated. She was warmer, more engaged, more willing to break from tradition when it suited her children's needs. She wanted William and Richard to have childhoods, not just training for a life of ceremonial ribbon-cutting. But the royal machine doesn't care what parents want. By the time William was old enough to understand what being a prince meant, the expectations were already calcifying around him. He would be educated at the best schools. He would serve in the military. He would marry appropriately. He would carry out royal duties when called upon. He would smile, wave, and never, ever complain. The Gloucesters weren't the stars of the royal family. But they were still players in the performance, and William, as the eldest son, would eventually inherit his father's title and his father's obligations. What nobody predicted was that William would refuse the script entirely. William Henry Andrew Frederick was born on December 18, 1941, at Hadley Common in Hertfordshire, where the family had temporarily relocated during the war. London was being bombed nightly. The royal family was scattered, seeking safety wherever they could find it. William entered a world at war, though he would have no memory of it. His birth was announced in the court circular with the usual formality. Congratulations poured in from around the Commonwealth. His grandfather, King George VI, sent a telegram. Winston Churchill, busy managing Britain's survival, took a moment to acknowledge the arrival of another prince. But there were no crowds outside the hospital, no photographers capturing the first glimpse of the baby. William was important enough to merit official recognition, but not important enough for public spectacle. Even from birth, he occupied that strange middle ground. The family returned to Barnwell Manor when William was still an infant. It would be his primary home for most of his childhood, a place of relative freedom compared to the stifling formality of royal residences in London. Barnwell was beautiful. The house itself was built of golden stone, with mullioned windows and Dutch gables. The grounds included formal gardens, a chapel, stables, and miles of farmland. There were woods to explore, a lake for fishing, and enough space that a boy could disappear for hours. William's early childhood photographs show a sturdy, serious-faced little boy with pale hair and large eyes. He looks like his mother, the same fine bone structure, the same slightly wary gaze. In some pictures, he's dressed in miniature aristocratic clothing. Tweed jackets, knee socks, carefully combed hair. In others, he's muddy and disheveled, clearly having been pulled away from some outdoor adventure. His brother Richard arrived when William was 3. The two boys were close, though their personalities diverged early. William was adventurous, restless, quick to anger, and quick to laugh. Richard was steadier, more cautious, content to follow where William led. Their mother Alice was the emotional center of their childhood. She read to them, played with them, and bent royal protocol whenever she thought it ridiculous. When palace officials suggested the boys should have separate bedrooms to maintain proper hierarchy, Alice ignored them. When advisors recommended hiring a stricter nanny to instill discipline, Alice declined. She wanted her sons to be princes, yes, but also to be happy. Prince Henry was a more distant figure. He loved his sons in his way, but he had been raised in an era when fathers, especially royal fathers, maintained emotional distance. He appeared at meals, asked about their studies, took them shooting when they were old enough. But he wasn't the parent they ran to with scraped knees or bad dreams. What William remembered most about his father, he later told friends, was the drinking. Not violent or abusive drinking, but the steady, numbing kind. Evening after evening, Prince Henry would retreat to his study with a bottle of whiskey. He would emerge for dinner, perform his role as paterfamilch, and then disappear again. Alice never complained. That wasn't what royal wives did. But William noticed. Even as a small child, he understood that his father was unhappy, trapped in a role he had never wanted and couldn't escape. Education began early. William had tutors at home before being sent to prep school at age 8. The school was Wellesley House in Kent, a traditional preparatory institution that fed boys into Eton and other elite public schools. It was William's first real experience living away from home, his first encounter with the brutality of British upper-class education. He hated it at first. The other boys either fawned over him because he was a prince, or resented him for the same reason. The masters treated him with exaggerated deference that made genuine connection impossible. He was homesick, lonely, and for the first time in his life, unable to escape into the freedom of Barnwell's woods. But William adapted. He learned to downplay his title, to make jokes at his own expense, to excel at sports so that his status was earned rather than merely inherited. He became popular, not despite being royal, but because he worked hard to make people forget he was. At 13, he went to Eton College, the most famous school in Britain, alma mater to prime ministers and future kings. His cousin Prince Philip had gone there. It was expected that William would thrive. He did, but not in the ways the palace hoped. William excelled academically, particularly in languages and history, but he also developed a reputation for rebelliousness. He challenged teachers who relied on rote memorization. He questioned traditions that seemed arbitrary. He befriended boys from less aristocratic backgrounds and avoided the most snobbish cliques, and he discovered speed. It started with motorcycles. At 16, against his father's explicit instructions, William bought a second-hand bike and taught himself to ride. He would roar through the Northamptonshire countryside, helmet off, hair whipping in the wind, feeling something he had never felt within palace walls. Free. His mother found out, of course. Alice was furious, not because of the rule-breaking, but because of the danger. She begged him to stop. William refused. For the first time in his life, he had found something that was entirely his own, something that had nothing to do with being a prince. The motorcycle became a car, then a faster car. By the time William was at Cambridge, he went to Magdalen College in 1960 to study history. He owned a Lotus Elan and drove it like he was trying to outrun his own bloodline. His friends remember him as brilliant but distracted, charming but restless. He would sit through lectures on medieval kingship and then spend weekends racing cars at amateur events. He dated, but never seriously. He drank, but not excessively. He seemed to be searching for something he couldn't name. What strikes me about this period is how William was trying to construct an identity separate from his royal status. At Cambridge, he insisted people call him William Gloucester, not Prince William. He avoided official university functions where he would be trotted out as a royal ornament. He wrote essays that questioned the relevance of monarchy in modern Britain. He was, in other words, asking the question that would haunt the rest of his short life. If I wasn't born a prince, who would I be? At Cambridge, he found a partial answer. He would be a scholar, a traveller, someone who understood the world beyond Britain's aristocratic bubble. He studied Japanese and learned enough to read basic texts. He became obsessed with African history and politics. He talked about joining the Foreign Office, about working abroad, about doing something meaningful. His father was baffled. Prince Henry had spent his entire life doing his duty without questioning it. The idea that his son might want something different, might reject the comfortable, predetermined path of a minor royal, was incomprehensible to him. Arguments began. Tense, bitter conversations where Prince Henry demanded William accept his responsibilities, and William countered that those responsibilities were meaningless. What was the point of cutting ribbons at hospital openings, of attending state banquets and making small talk with politicians, of being a decorative element in someone else's story? Alice tried to mediate, but she was caught between her husband's expectations and her son's yearning for autonomy. She understood William's frustration. She had felt it herself, the suffocating weight of a life scripted by protocol. But she also knew that rebelling openly would only bring more scrutiny, more pressure. In 1963, William graduated from Cambridge with a degree in history. He was 21 years old, handsome, well-educated, and expected to begin a life of royal service. Instead, he announced he was joining the Foreign Office and requested a posting abroad. The palace was shocked. Younger sons of minor royals sometimes had careers, but they were usually in the military or finance, positions that maintained social status. The Foreign Office was acceptable, but actually working, being a junior diplomat in some distant embassy, was unprecedented. William didn't care. For the first time in his life, he had leverage. He was an adult, he had skills, and crucially, the palace needed him to be useful. The royal family was beginning to realize that pure ceremonial roles weren't enough anymore. The public wanted royals who did real work, who earned their keep. So they agreed. In 1965, Prince William was posted to Lagos, Nigeria, as a third secretary in the British High Commission. He was finally getting out. Lagos in 1965 was a city transformed. Nigeria had gained independence from Britain just 5 years earlier, and the capital was booming with post-colonial energy. New buildings rose alongside colonial-era structures. The streets were chaotic, vibrant, filled with people who had no particular reverence for British royalty. William loved it immediately. For the first time in his life, he was semi-anonymous. Yes, people knew he was a prince. The British High Commission made sure of that. But he was a working diplomat, not a ceremonial figure. He wrote reports, he attended meetings, he learned about Nigerian politics, economics, and culture. He was useful. His colleagues remember him as unpretentious and hard-working. He didn't pull rank or demand special treatment. He lived in a relatively modest apartment rather than the grandest available accommodation. He drove his own car. He shopped in local markets. He tried as much as possible to be normal. He also fell in love. Her name was Nicole Seif, though most accounts refer to her as Zuzi Starkloff, the name from her second marriage. She was a stunning Hungarian former model who had fled Europe after World War II and eventually settled in Tokyo, where she worked as a model and television personality. By the time she met William, she was divorced, worldly, and utterly unsuitable by royal standards. They met in Tokyo in 1968 when William was briefly posted there. The attraction was instant and mutual. Zuzi was beautiful, intelligent, and completely unimpressed by titles. William was a prince who didn't want to be treated like one. They were perfect for each other. The relationship developed quickly. William visited Zuzi whenever his schedule allowed. She flew to meet him in various cities. They talked about everything: politics, philosophy, the absurdity of inherited privilege. For William, Zuzi represented everything the royal world wasn't: authentic, free, chosen rather than assigned. But there was a catastrophic problem. Zuzi was divorced, and according to the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, William could not marry a divorced woman without the monarch's permission. Given that his own uncle, Edward VIII, had been forced to abdicate for marrying a divorcee, that permission was never going to come. William knew this. Zuzi knew this. They pursued the relationship anyway, half hoping that times had changed enough, that being a minor royal might give William freedoms that direct heirs didn't have. They were wrong. When the palace learned about Zuzi, the response was immediate and brutal. William was called back to London for a series of meetings with his father, with palace officials, with the Queen herself. The message was clear. This relationship ends, or you give up your titles, your income, and your place in the family. William tried to argue. He pointed out that he was 9th in line to the throne, so far removed that his marriage couldn't possibly matter to the succession. He reminded them that he had done everything asked of him, had built a genuine career, had represented Britain honorably abroad. Didn't he deserve some personal happiness? The answer was no. Royal duty didn't allow for personal happiness when it conflicted with protocol. Love was secondary to tradition. Always, I think this was the moment William's heart broke. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a dam cracking under constant pressure. He had tried so hard to build a life that balanced royal duty with personal authenticity. He had believed, perhaps naively, that if he worked hard enough and stayed far enough from the center of royal life, he might be allowed to make his own choices. But the palace didn't work that way. There was no distance great enough, no achievement significant enough. He was a prince, and that meant his life would never truly be his own. In 1970, William returned to Britain permanently. His Foreign Office career was over. The official reason was that his father's health was declining and he needed to take on more royal duties. The real reason was to separate him from Gloucester. He obeyed. Because at the end of the day, despite all his rebellions, William was still his father's son. He had been raised to understand duty, sacrifice, and the subordination of personal desire to family obligation. But something in him had died. Friends noticed the change. He was quieter, more cynical. The restless energy that had defined him was still there, but it had turned darker, more reckless. He started flying planes. William had always been fascinated by aviation. As a child, he had built model airplanes and begged to visit RAF bases. But it wasn't until he returned to Britain, heartbroken and trapped, that he seriously pursued piloting. He enrolled in flying lessons at the Cambridge Aero Club in early 1970. His instructor, a former RAF pilot named John Russell, later recalled that William was a natural. He had excellent spatial awareness, quick reflexes, and the kind of fearlessness that made him both an exceptional pilot and a dangerous one. Within months, William had his private pilot's license. He bought a share in a Piper Cherokee Arrow, a sleek, single-engine aircraft painted scarlet and white. He flew constantly, often alone, pushing the aircraft's limits in ways that alarmed more experienced pilots. His mother begged him to be careful. Alice had already lost so much, her youth to royal duty, her dreams to protocol, her marriage to her husband's alcoholism and depression. The thought of losing her son to a plane crash terrified her, but William couldn't stop. Flying was the only thing that gave him the same feeling he had experienced with Gloucester, the same sense of absolute freedom. In the cockpit, thousands of feet above England, he wasn't a prince. He wasn't ninth in line to anything. He was just a man and a machine and the sky. He joined the Royal Aero Club and began competing in air races. These were small, amateur events, nothing like Formula One or professional motorsports, but they gave William a sense of purpose. He could win or lose based on skill, not birthright. His closest friends during this period were fellow pilots, mechanics, and aviation enthusiasts. They were mostly middle-class men who loved flying for its own sake. They treated William as an equal, called him Bill, shared hangar space and technical advice. One of these friends was Viral Mitchell, a 37-year-old experienced pilot and aircraft dealer. Mitchell was practical, level-headed, and genuinely liked William. He became a kind of unofficial mentor, teaching William advanced techniques and occasionally talking him out of particularly risky maneuvers. But Mitchell also enabled William's recklessness. He flew with William in competitions, pushed him to improve, and never quite said the thing that needed to be said, that William was using aviation as a death wish disguised as a hobby, because that's what it was starting to look like. William flew in bad weather. He attempted aerobatic maneuvers he wasn't fully trained for. He talked about buying a stunt plane, about learning to do barrel rolls and loop the loops. People who knew him worried. His brother Richard, now in his mid-20s and preparing to take on royal duties himself, tried to talk to William about the risks. William brushed him off. His father, Prince Henry, barely noticed. By 1972, Prince Henry was in rapid decline. Decades of heavy drinking had destroyed his liver and damaged his heart. He spent most of his time at Barnwell, increasingly frail, occasionally lucid, often not. The dukedom of Gloucester would soon pass to William, and with it, all the responsibilities he had spent his adult life trying to escape. William knew this. He knew that his father's death would trap him permanently. He would become the duke, take on official duties, attend state occasions, and live the rest of his life in the very cage he had worked so hard to escape. So he flew, faster, higher, more recklessly, as if he could outrun what was coming. The Goodyear International Air Trophy was a prestigious amateur flying competition held annually in Britain. In 1972, it was scheduled for August 28th at Halfpenny Green Airfield in Staffordshire. William registered to compete. His mother Alice pleaded with him not to go. She had a terrible feeling, she said, a premonition that something would go wrong. William laughed it off. He had competed in races before. He was experienced. There was nothing to worry about. The days leading up to the competition were busy. William had royal duties to fulfill, a garden party at Barnwell, meetings about his father's deteriorating health, discussions about what would happen when he inherited the dukedom. He handled it all with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to compartmentalize. But in private, friends noticed he seemed agitated. He talked obsessively about the race, about the modifications he had made to his plane, about how he planned to win. It was as if this competition had taken on enormous symbolic weight, as if winning would prove something important. August 28th dawned clear and warm. Perfect flying weather. William drove to Halfpenny Green early, Viral Mitchell in the passenger seat. They went over the flight plan, checked the aircraft, made final adjustments. The Piper Cherokee Arrow had been modified slightly for racing. Nothing dramatic, just minor tweaks to improve speed and handling. William had overseen the work himself, determined to have every possible advantage. At approximately 1:30 p.m., William and Mitchell took off. The plan was to complete a circuit around a designated course, demonstrating both speed and precision. Thousands of spectators watched from below, some with binoculars, others just enjoying the spectacle of vintage and modern aircraft filling the sky. For the first few minutes, everything went perfectly. The plane climbed smoothly, banking into the first turn with confidence. William was in his element, focused, skilled, free. And then, something went wrong. Witnesses disagree on exactly what happened. Some say the plane suddenly pitched nose down, as if the elevator controls had jammed. Others report seeing the aircraft roll sharply to one side. A few mention hearing the engine sputter, suggesting possible mechanical failure. What everyone agrees on is this. At approximately 1:32 p.m., the Piper Cherokee Arrow fell out of the sky. It didn't glide down. It didn't make a controlled emergency landing. It plummeted, spinning, utterly out of control. The plane hit the ground in a field near Wolverhampton at devastating speed. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated on contact, metal and fuel, and human bodies transformed instantly into wreckage. Prince William of Gloucester died instantly. So did Viral Mitchell. From takeoff to impact, 75 seconds. The crowd that had been cheering moments before fell silent. For several long seconds, nobody moved. It was as if the human brain needed time to process what had just happened, the sudden violent shift from entertainment to tragedy. Then the screaming started. Ambulances were called. Fire crews rushed to the crash site, though it was immediately clear there was no one to save. The fuel had ignited, and flames consumed what was left of the aircraft. Officials from the Royal Aero Club reached the wreckage first. One of them later described it as the worst thing I've ever seen. There was nothing recognizable as human, just twisted metal and fire and the chemical smell of burning aviation fuel. Someone had to identify the bodies. Someone had to call Barnwell Manor. Someone had to tell Alice that her worst premonition had come true. Word reached the palace within the hour. Queen Elizabeth II was informed. She immediately sent a message to Alice expressing her shock and grief. Protocol officers began preparing for the official announcement. At Barnwell, Alice was hosting a small garden party, one of those provincial royal obligations that filled the calendar of minor royals. She was making polite conversation with local dignitaries when a servant appeared and whispered that she had an urgent phone call. She knew. Before she even picked up the receiver, Alice knew. A mother knows. Prince Henry was too ill to fully comprehend what had happened. He understood that William was dead, understood that his son had crashed, but his mind was too damaged by alcohol and disease to grasp the enormity of it. He would die himself less than 2 years later, having never truly mourned. Richard, William's younger brother, was in London when he heard. He later said that his first thought was, "It should have been me." Not because he wanted to die, but because William had been the vibrant one, the one who was actually living. Richard had always been content with royal duty. William had fought it every day of his life. The official announcement came that evening. The Queen has learned with great sorrow of the death of her cousin, Prince William of Gloucester, in an air accident today. Her Majesty is sending a message of sympathy to Princess Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester. The newspapers ran the story on the front page, but not as the lead. August 28, 1972, was a busy news day. The Munich Olympics were about to begin. Political tensions in Northern Ireland were escalating. Prince William's death was tragic, certainly, but he wasn't a major royal. The coverage was respectful, but brief. Within days, it had disappeared from the papers entirely. The Air Accidents Investigation Branch launched an immediate inquiry into the crash. They recovered what they could of the wreckage, interviewed witnesses, and analyzed weather conditions and the aircraft's maintenance records. Their findings were inconclusive. The official report, released months later, stated that the probable cause was a loss of control during an aerobatic maneuver. But it couldn't determine exactly what mechanical failure or pilot error had triggered the fatal sequence. Some investigators suspected that William had attempted a banking turn too aggressively, causing the plane to stall. Others pointed to potential issues with the elevator controls. Modifications made for racing might have compromised structural integrity. There were also rumors, never officially confirmed, that William had been performing unauthorized aerobatic maneuvers. The flight plan called for a standard circuit race. But several witnesses claimed they saw the plane executing a roll or attempting a loop moments before the crash. If true, this would align with everything we know about William's personality in those final months. Reckless, pushing boundaries, treating every flight like it might be his last. Was it suicide? Probably not in the deliberate sense. William wasn't depressed in the clinical way we understand the term now, but was he engaging in increasingly dangerous behavior, subconsciously seeking an exit from a life he couldn't escape any other way? I think the answer is yes. Flying had become William's only realm of true freedom. And when that freedom started to feel insufficient, when even the sky couldn't give him what he needed, he pushed harder, flew faster, took greater risks. The crash wasn't an accident in the sense of pure bad luck. It was the inevitable conclusion of a man testing limits because he couldn't accept the ones imposed on him by birth. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, on September 2nd, 1972. It was a full royal funeral, military honours, a horse-drawn gun carriage, all the pageantry that William had spent his life trying to avoid. The Queen attended, Prince Philip attended, the entire royal family turned out, dressed in black, faces appropriately solemn. Alice, dressed in a black veil, walked behind the coffin with Richard beside her. Photographs from that day show her as a woman barely holding herself together. Her face is frozen in grief so profound it looks like physical pain. There was no Juicy. She wasn't invited. She wasn't acknowledged. As far as official royal history was concerned, she had never existed. But she mourned. Years later, in interviews, Zuzi described William as the love of her life. She never remarried. She kept his letters, his photographs, his memory alive in private, even as the palace erased him from public consciousness. Alice, Duchess of Gloucester, lived for another 32 years after William's death. She never fully recovered. She continued her royal duties because that's what was expected. She attended state occasions, opened hospitals, supported charities. But friends said the light had gone out of her. She had lost her vibrant, rebellious son. Her husband was dying slowly and miserably. The future she had imagined, where William would inherit the dukedom and perhaps, eventually, find some happiness, was gone. Prince Henry died in June 1974, less than 2 years after William. His liver and heart finally gave out after decades of abuse. He was 74 years old. The dukedom of Gloucester passed to Richard, who had never wanted it and had never prepared for it. Richard, by all accounts, was devastated by the double loss. He and William had been close, despite their different temperaments. Richard had always assumed William would be the duke, would handle the heavy lifting of royal obligations, while Richard could live a quieter life on the periphery. Instead, at 30 years old, Richard became the Duke of Gloucester and a working member of the royal family. He married Birgitte vanEur, a Danish secretary, later that year. Together, they took on the endless round of duties that William had fought so hard to avoid. Richard carried out his responsibilities with quiet dignity. He never spoke publicly about William's death in detail. He never gave interviews about their childhood or his brother's struggles. He became exactly what William had refused to be: a dutiful, uncomplaining minor royal who accepted his role without question. But in private, according to those close to the family, Richard grieved deeply. He kept photographs of William in his study. He visited the crash site occasionally, standing silently in the field where his brother had died. Zuzi Starkloff tried to attend the funeral but was turned away. She returned to her life in Los Angeles, carrying a grief she could never fully share because the world didn't acknowledge her right to mourn. In interviews decades later, she spoke about William with a mixture of love and anger. Love for the man he was, anger at the system that destroyed him. "He was the most authentic person I ever met," she said in one interview. "He hated being royal. He just wanted to be free, and they wouldn't let him." She described their last conversation, shortly before the crash. William had called her from England, sounding tired and resigned. He talked about his father's declining health, about the dukedom he would soon inherit, about how his life was closing in around him. "I asked him if he would ever come back to me," Zuzi recalled. "He said he wanted to, but he also said he knew he couldn't. He was trapped." The palace never acknowledged Zuzi's existence in official histories. When biographies of the royal family were published, William was mentioned briefly, tragically killed in an air crash in 1972, and then the narrative moved on. His relationship with Zuzi was erased. His Foreign Office career was mentioned in passing, without context. His struggles with royal duty were ignored entirely. He became a footnote, a minor tragedy in a family that had experienced so many larger ones. What's remarkable about Prince William of Gloucester is how thoroughly he has been erased from popular consciousness. Ask most people to name members of the British royal family from the 1960s and 70s, and they'll mention Queen Elizabeth, Prince Philip, Princess Margaret, Prince Charles. They won't mention William. Even among royal enthusiasts, he's barely known. He doesn't appear in most documentaries. There are no major biographies. His Wikipedia page is shorter than those of far less significant figures. Part of this is timing. He died young, before the age of celebrity media saturation. He was a minor royal who actively avoided publicity during his life. And his death was overshadowed by bigger news. But I think there's another reason for his erasure. He was inconvenient. William's story doesn't fit the narrative the royal family wants to tell about itself. He was a prince who rejected duty, who fell in love with someone unsuitable and refused to simply move on, who died doing something reckless that embarrassed the institution. He was a reminder that the gilded cage is still a cage. That privilege doesn't guarantee happiness. That some people would rather die than spend their lives in performative servitude. So the palace forgot him. Not maliciously, necessarily, but through the passive act of simply not mentioning him, not including him in official histories, not preserving his memory. His mother Alice tried, in her quiet way. She kept his room at Barnwell exactly as he had left it. She commissioned a memorial plaque at the crash site. She spoke about him occasionally to close friends, keeping his memory alive in private even as it faded in public. But Alice died in 2004, and with her went the last person who had truly known William, who could testify to who he really was beneath the titles and expectations. Today there's a memorial stone in the grounds of St. George's Chapel, Windsor. It marks the spot where William is buried. The inscription is simple: Prince William of Gloucester, 1941 to 1972, son of Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester. That's it. No mention of his intelligence, his courage, his rebellion, his love. Just dates and a genealogical fact. It's not enough. I believe Prince William of Gloucester deserves to be remembered not as a footnote, but as a fully realized human being who struggled with questions that remain relevant today. What does it mean to be born into a role you never chose? How do you build an authentic life when your identity has been predetermined? When does duty become a prison? And what happens when personal happiness conflicts irreconcilably with family obligation? These aren't just royal problems. They're human problems. Millions of people live with versions of William's dilemma. The child of immigrants expected to honor their parents' sacrifices while forging their own path. The person born into a family business who dreams of something else. Anyone who has felt the weight of expectation so heavy it becomes suffocating. William's tragedy is that he lived in an era and a family where there was no escape hatch. He couldn't abdicate like Edward VIII because he wasn't important enough for abdication to even be an option. He couldn't simply walk away because the financial and social consequences would have been devastating. He was trapped by birth, by duty, by a system that values tradition over individual autonomy. And so he flew, higher and faster and more recklessly, until the only escape left was the one he found in a field in Staffordshire on a summer afternoon in 1972. What haunts me most is how hard he tried. William didn't just accept his fate and sink into bitterness. He joined the Foreign Office. He worked in Africa and Japan. He built real relationships with people who valued him for himself. He fell deeply in love. He pursued aviation with genuine passion. He tried to build a life that balanced duty with authenticity. And the system crushed him anyway. The palace won. They always win. William is gone, erased, reduced to a name on a memorial stone. The institution continues, impervious to individual suffering, grinding on through generations. But William deserves more than that. He deserves to be remembered as a prince who refused to be only a prince, who loved a woman he couldn't marry and flew planes because it was the only time he felt truly alive, who died at 30, having spent most of his short life fighting for freedoms that should have been his birthright as a human being. He was brave, he was flawed, he was real, and he should not be forgotten. If you enjoyed learning about Prince William of Gloucester, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories from history that deserve to be remembered.